What if I told you that Vince McMahon may have covered up a murder? Now, you might respond by saying, that's insane, or no way. Granted, it is highly unlikely that Vince McMahon himself covered up a murder. However, in 2020, Dark Side of the Ring produced an episode on Jimmy Snuka and the death of his girlfriend, Nancy Argentino. Now, in this episode, they made mention in passing of an intricate detail of a secret meeting between Jimmy, Vincent Kennedy McMahon, and the Allentown, Pennsylvania authorities. Nancy Argentino passed away on May 11th, 1983 from injuries to her skull and neck at the hands of Jimmy Superfly Snuka. And just 5 months later, on October 17, 1983, with the assault to his girlfriend living in his conscience, Snuka did this. Oh my God! That right there is a moment that catapulted Snuka to wrestling immortality. Mick Foley and thousands others watched on from the crowd, and Mick himself even vowed to become a WWE superstar one day. And that was all due to his love for Snuka and that fateful splash from the top of the cage. Now, Snuka had already been a star prior to the leap, as he headlined several house shows for the WWF, and he was the company's top babyface for a few years prior to Hogan joining the company. But little did Foley and the millions of fans that were captivated by Snuka's leap know that the man they were heroizing was a cold-blooded murderer. The murder charges, however, were dropped in early 2017 due to Snuka's deteriorating health at the hands of old age and stomach cancer. Argentino's family, they were still satisfied to get any slimmer of closure, and seeing Snuka charged with heinous acts was enough. Debate could be had of whether Snuka's legacy has been affected by the incident. I'm not here for that though. But I will say this. How this case is treated similarly to the murder of Bruiser Brody, and it's like it's been buried behind the scenes and behind the times before social media, cell phones, and a focus on wrestling in the mainstream media. Immediately following the death of Argentino, Snuka allegedly retold the story of her passing with slightly different details each time. He recollected the story 30 years later during an interview on the Opie show, where he stated that Nancy fell after using the bathroom on the side of the road during a road trip. You can see the host of the show, like, they know the details. Snuka knows the details. Like, everybody pretty much knows that he's lying in the interview, and it's very odd to watch, honestly. Now, according to reports, what actually transpired that night in their hotel room in Allentown, Pennsylvania, is that Snuka struck Argentino to the point that it had severely damaged her skull and she could never recover. Police were called to the hotel, and upon arrival, they found a naked Snuka standing over Argentino as she lay in bed with the sheets wrapped around her. Snuka was talking to the police and said that she hit her head and was tired, but the trauma unit determined by a glossy look in her eye that Argentino had suffered severe head trauma. Upon being arrested, Snuka would later be released after an unknown, quote, manager bailed him out of jail, stating that the superstar needed to wrestle a match later that night or in the weekend. This, quote, manager is alleged to have been Vince McMahon, the promoter of the then WWF and now WWE. This is where details get tricky. The family of Argentino alleges that McMahon called them shortly after her death and offered them $25,000 in hush money to no longer speak about Snuka or the incident. Of course, the family declined, as they had spoken openly about the incident for years and tried to get the police to reopen the case several times. In his autobiography, Snuka recalled a meeting with local police that involved himself, McMahon, and a few high-ranking authorities from Lehigh County in Pennsylvania. Snuka recounted that McMahon walked into the meeting with a briefcase and then left the room shortly thereafter, proclaiming that the issue had been resolved. Had Vince McMahon just covered up a murder involving one of his top stars? Now, in the 1980s, the Italian-American mafia was involved in all sorts of sports, including boxing, college basketball, and others. It would not surprise me if they had a hand in the WWF as well, and McMahon was simply playing his role in keeping the peace. At the time, the general population thought that wrestling was real, making it a potentially profitable resource for the gambling operations that the mafia ran in the Northeast. Being that the WWF was based out of New York, I would not be surprised if this was indeed the case. Ian Riccaboni tweeted, quote, "There are plenty of rumors around here. I hope none of them are true. There are presumed open secrets related to the local government's handling of the May 1983 events that the Vice crew probably deemed too risky to put out without some sort of paper trail." Now, this tweet is not the end-all be-all in this situation, but it does add fuel to the fire of this conspiracy theory that McMahon actually covered up a murder. If a local Pennsylvanian and noted wrestling history buff like Riccaboni is speaking from first-hand knowledge of the area where this murder took place and its overall perception of how it was handled, that says something to me. I don't know about you, but that's just me. Also, why was the case buried in a file drawer for over 30 years without being revisited, and it was simply labeled as an accidental death? After the case was reopened in the 2010s, there was a never-before-seen autopsy report from the time it happened that ruled her death a homicide. This is all shady to me and should be to you too. Now, what does all of this actually mean? On one hand, Snuka was heavily ill when he wrote his book and took part in an ensuing media tour to promote it. Perhaps he had a foggy recollection of a meeting with Vince and the authorities that never actually happened to begin with. On the other hand, McMahon, who had very real incentive to protect one of, if not his biggest star at the time, took matters into his own hands and got his star out of trouble by any means possible. Whichever side of the coin you personally fall on, it is safe to say that this is one of the absolute craziest conspiracy theories in the history of pro wrestling, and it isn't even that widely talked about. The murder of Argentino itself has been talked about for years and years and on several public media forums, but the details and possibility of McMahon covering up the murder is seldom brought up. The case was reopened after a report from the Morning Call that brought to light the aforementioned unreleased autopsy report. In the report, a forensic pathologist suggested that the case be investigated as a homicide. Instead, the autopsy was hidden for 3 decades, and the case was just ruled an accident and thrown out. I am no expert of the law when I say this, but something does not add up in this whole situation. Here is another caveat in the equation. Tonka Kid claims that he was in the car during the road trip on the day of Argentino's death. For those of you who don't know, Tonga is a member of the Samoan family dynasty and was a close ally of Snuka. He was asked about Snuka's claim of Nancy falling while using the bathroom on the side of the road, to which he replied, "That never happened." Now, Tonga was not out to get Snuka in this Dark Side documentary. Tonga was extremely defensive of Snuka and was his closest companion in the documentary by far. He was just being honest and probably did more to hurt his friend's image than help it with his brutal honesty. When the Lehigh County police chief who oversaw the case was asked about Tonga Kid being present in the car, he had no idea of such a detail and was visibly thrown off. The case was dismissed in 2017, like I said, after Snuka was deemed unfit to trial, thanks to his living condition, and he was only given 6 months to live. Thus, not giving the Argentino family the satisfaction of watching the man responsible for their beloved family member's death rot in jail. However, in the end, one of WWE's most lovable icons will have a lasting stain on his legacy that even Vince McMahon's hush money cannot remove. This is one of many instances of the very real life that our on-screen heroes live and serves as a reminder to not idolize these figures we see on our TV screens. They are in fact just people who make mistakes like anyone else and oftentimes are capable of seriously dangerous things. So I'll ask you, the viewer, where do you stand on this scenario? Do you believe that Vince McMahon covered up a murder? Do you think the story of the secret meeting was a fabrication from a senile old man who suffered from years of head trauma? Are you somewhere in the middle? And yeah, I'll leave you with that. If you enjoyed this type of hard-hitting content, please let me know in the comments, and I'll talk to you on the next episode of Wrestling Uncovered. Thank you.